invite now Christopher Dielmann, CPA from Senior Economist at Exotix Capital.
Can I borrow the stand, actually? For the sake of brevity, I'll try to make it through this presentation relatively quickly, and thank you all for sticking around. Obviously, we're a little bit late. Thank you very much to the panel and to Faisal Rashid for hosting this APPG. My name is Christopher Dielmann. I'm a senior economist with Exotix Capital. Before joining Exotix about a year ago, I spent the last 4 years at the IMF, where I was head of all debt sustainability model. Ultimately, in that role, I became very interested in what BRI and especially CPEC meant for countries that are taking on additional debt burdens from the state of China, also through public corporations, and through this sort of opaque series of loans. Ultimately, that's what I'll try to focus on during my presentation, both addressing the pros and the cons of this situation. You've already heard a lot about what CPEC is, what BRI is. You've heard about the 78 countries that span around 2/3 of the globe, affecting more than half of the world's population. You've also heard about some of the merits of these projects. I mean, in Pakistan alone, we have CPEC, which is about $60 billion worth of investment, primarily going into redeveloping the Gwadar port, infrastructure, logistical transportation networks, and $30 billion worth of power. We've also seen in other countries, for example, Kenya, where standard gauge rail was opened last year, which has shaved off a tremendous amount of traveling time between the capital city of Nairobi and the port of Mombasa. Now, these successes of these programs aren't merely anecdotal. So based on very rough calculations across the 64 original countries that were included in CPEC, ignoring China, in BRI, real GDP growth is expected to grow at an average rate of nearly 1% faster between the years of 2015 and 2023. If we add this up, this will translate into nearly $4 trillion of additional wealth. Given the immense scope, vision, and development and focus of BRI, some have likened it to the equivalent of a Chinese Marshall Plan. There are certainly merits to this comparison. However, there's a stark contrast between the design of the Marshall Plan, which centered on providing grant aid, that is, free budgetary support for providing capital and goods, whereas BRI is centered around the notion of development financing through the use of guaranteed loans. Now, this may sound like a trivial difference, but it's certainly anything but. As through the loan financing, this ultimately places the liabilities on the recipient country rather than on the donor country. As a result, we're beginning to bear witness to the downside of these increased liabilities that are being taken on by recipient countries. Montenegro, for example, had its credit rating downgraded by Moody's in 2016 after borrowing nearly 1/4 of its GDP to finance the first stage of the BRI highway project. The standard gauge rail that I just discussed earlier, which is obviously being touted as a great success, recent reports said that it lost nearly $100 million in its first year of operation, which is now causing concerns about whether or not financing will be available for the phase 2 of this project. And just yesterday, Malaysia reported that they've canceled 3 more BRI-backed pipeline projects after having already suspended $23 billion in projects in the past to avoid incurring additional debt burdens. Now, there are 2 aspects of BRI-related financing that I find particularly worrisome. The first being the lack of transparency that some of our panel members and some of the questions from the audience have already addressed. Often we simply do not know the size, cost, or timeline of many of these loans. The other issue, and one that I think will have grave implications for global financial architecture, will be the way in which China behaves as a creditor if debtors are unwilling or unable to repay on original terms. Recent examples of BRI-related projects that were attempted to be restructured are the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka and Zesco, Zambia's power utility, both of which have effectively been assumed by Chinese ownership, following disputes of payments through BRI-related issues. Though this next example is not directly related to BRI, I think it is very important to address. The Republic of Congo currently finds itself in a very precarious situation, likely requiring a restructuring of its external liabilities. While this process would have historically gone through the Paris Club, a formal organization that the High Commissioner has already addressed earlier tonight, and in conjunction with the World Bank and the IMF, the Republic of Congo situation will be very different, as roughly 40% of their total liabilities are owed to China, thus making it the single largest creditor, and also not a member of the Paris Club. To my knowledge, this will likely be the first case of an international debt renegotiation where debt owed to the Paris Club is smaller than that to a single sovereign. This will result in the influence of the Paris Club being relatively moot and ultimately calling into question all that we know in terms of how these negotiations have historically played out. Pakistan is arguably the most important piece in the BRI puzzle through its involvement in CPEC. CPEC investment is roughly $60 billion, comprising the expansion of the Guadalajara port, as we've already discussed, and $30 billion for power plants. On the back of this, Pakistan is projected to grow at nearly 6% a year in real term over the next 5 years. However, there's also a potential debt crisis on the back of the current account deficit that has ballooned following the completion of their last IMF program in September of 2016. It's increased from about $1.7 billion deficit at the end of 2016 to nearly $6 billion over the last fiscal year. This deficit is driven almost entirely by the worsening of the country's trade balance. That is the difference between the exports and imports, which are projected to be roughly $15 billion worse in 2018 than they were in 2016. Higher oil prices have obviously added to this worsening. However, the largest driver is an increase in CPEC-related imports. As a result, the country has been forced to devalue its currency by 20% throughout 2018, and foreign reserves have fallen by more than half in just over a year and a half, leaving the country with little option other than likely to turn to the IMF again for another bailout package. Now, the High Commissioner already addressed the issue of debt and who holds the debt, mentioning that only about 10% of the debt is actually owed to China. In Pakistan's case, it's not really a question of debt burden or debt unsustainability. It's really a question of fiscal unsustainability based on very extreme external imbalances. The question is, can a country just take on a significant amount of additional burdens which will require external financing, dollar financing that they receive from countries like China, which ultimately hurts their foreign reserves, hurts their currencies, and leads to a widening current account deficit. In Pakistan's situation, given the status quo, this is a very unsustainable situation. Now, given this, 14 United States senators signed a letter urging the United States Treasury on their behalf to try to prevent the IMF from re-engaging with Pakistan, as in their eyes, it would be effectively just a bailout package that Pakistan could use to repay China. Ultimately, this is something that the US Treasury is obviously trying to avoid. Now, obviously, I'm not privy to the inner workings of the IMF, having left that position a year ago. I suspect that the IMF will likely ignore that letter, especially given the collapse between the relationship of the US current administration and the relatively international body that the IMF is. However, the balance of payments woes are very real and something that will need significant financial assistance. Now, there's been talk as to whether or not Pakistan will be able to raise additional financing from China, but we're talking in the range of probably close to $15 billion over the next year alone. China has provided an additional $3 billion in grant aid over the last 3 months, basically just to keep foreign reserve levels at about 2 months of import cover. Anyone who's an economist who looks at these numbers, that is a very worrying degree. The question is, what is China's impetus in all of this? What is really their driving, motivating factor in providing this grant? I think ultimately the question is trying to keep Pakistan afloat as long as they can until they can get themselves in an IMF program so the IMF can step in and provide that financial assistance. China does not have any incentive in providing an additional $15 billion to Pakistan only so that they can be repaid back. That does not make any sense to me. So ultimately, I think the question will be whether or not the benefits of BRI will outweigh the costs. And I think from a Chinese perspective, and likely from a Pakistani perspective from the administration, I think the answers are very likely to be yes. That we've heard tonight. Now, the question is this the case for other countries as well? I think the answer is a little bit more complicated. I mean, like I said, we have to consider countries like Montenegro, we have to consider Kenya, we have to consider the current state of Pakistan, where things aren't quite as simple as simply building infrastructure, receiving the GDP growth as a result of that, and having a country turn out to be successful from a development perspective. But ultimately, I think the amount of infrastructure development, GDP boosting expenditure, increased trade flows, that all lead to increased human capital and efficiencies, have the ability to be a watershed moment for nearly every country involved. But that does not mean that there will not be isolated hiccups and struggles along the way. things that have been referred to as teething pains earlier tonight. As an economist, it is vital that we consider both the pros and cons of this initiative honestly in order to help us understand what challenges will be faced. The sooner we realize what these challenges will be, the greater chance that countries have of mitigating them or avoiding them in the first place. Be that through a reduction in scope, an increase in transparency, or mutual cooperation with the development agencies, such as the World Bank and IMF, and others that can ensure that the country does not over-leverage itself in the short run while pursuing its long-run objectives.
Thank you very much, Chris. Obviously, as we know, we're on a little bit of time, so we've got only 7 minutes to go.